Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Flood Risk Management Working Group, the first meeting of the Flood Risk Management Working Group, which has been set up by the Environment Select Committee to look at flooding risk management in the borough, with a specific focus, of course, on last year's flooding incidents on 12th July 2021. As part of this working group, we're going to be having a range of meetings, tonight of which is the first. The rest will be throughout September and October. And we're going to be focusing on a range of topics across flooding risk management. Tonight is on the Section 19 report, which was commissioned by RBKC in response to the July 12 incident. That's something that we legally have to produce as part of the aftermath of any significant flooding events in the borough. So we'll be looking at various sections of that, and I'll explain a little bit what the agenda will be. But I also wanted to briefly talk about what we're going to be doing more broadly as part of this work throughout the rest of the autumn. We're also going to have an entire meeting dedicated to talking about SUDs, sustainable urban drainage schemes. We're going to be looking specifically on the impact on residents and businesses. Now, of course, that's something which essentially is a part of all these meetings, in a sense, of course. But we're going to have a meeting that will specifically look at topics like insurance, for example, how we can help residents and businesses recover, what role the council can play, so on and so forth. So that's going to be entirely focused on residents and businesses. Session 4 will be focused on Thames Water, their role in risk management, in flooding event, and we'll also be looking at the independent review which Thames Water commissioned, the independent expert group, and we'll be inviting them as well to attend that meeting. And I know there's been some interest also in being able to question the authors of that particular report. Again, I stress that was commissioned by Thames Water. Tonight's report is a separate one, specifically focused on the borough, which was commissioned by RBKC. And finally, last but not least, we'll be looking at how we can improve cooperation across borough, our neighbouring boroughs, Fulham, Westminster, and so on, to see how we can better improve our flooding risk management with cross-borough cooperation. And we'll be looking at all the evidence that we'll be gathering across those meetings to see what kind of recommendations we as a working group can come up with. So that's broadly what our working group will be doing over the next couple of months. What we'll be doing this evening then is looking at the Section 19 report, and in a few minutes I'll ask for that to be introduced by the officers. We'll start by a quick overview of the report as a whole, and then throughout the meeting we'll focus on different areas. As you can see in the agenda in front of you, we'll have a look specifically at last year's event, so what happened there, the immediate aftermath. Then we'll take almost a step back and look at, well, what can we do to stop this happening again, about this management, what we can do, what we are doing now, what we can do in the future. We'll have a look again at the impact on communities, businesses, and what the report says on that. We'll have a look at the recommendations that were included as part of the report. And last but certainly not least, we'll then open up to members of the public present if they have questions as well. So we'll try to give up the last 20 minutes. Okay then, without any further ado, if my colleagues could briefly introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name is Aryan Areti of Fulham Ward. I just have something to declare. I've got a planning meeting at 6:30, so I have to be just shortly. Thank you very much.
My name is Eva Jewitt from Dalgarno Ward.
Councillor Stuart Graham, Councillor for Northern.
Hamish Durian from Portsmouth.
Joanna Gardner, Pembridge Ward, and as you'll see from the report, Pembridge did have some flooding.
There was something on the else code. Should finally mention, of course, this meeting is being broadcast on YouTube, so welcome to anyone who's joining us live over the YouTube. And now straight on to item number 3, and can I ask James Latham to introduce the report?
Yes, so I'm James Latham. I'm the Principal Flood and Water Management Officer at the Council. And I form the lead local flood authority role in the Council that came to us in 2010 as part of Flood and Water Management Act. I think it's useful to put that in context. As part of the Flood and Water Management Act, Section 19 says that authorities, on becoming aware of a flood in the area, need to investigate, and it sets out broadly what needs to happen with that investigation. But it also doesn't go into lots of detail about what the investigation has to consider. So we haven't had a significant event in the borough between 2010 and 2021. So this is the first investigation that we have undertaken. So as part of that, we commissioned JBA Consulting to support us in undertaking that investigation, undertaking that statutory duty. So JBA helped compile the reports alongside lots of input from officers, from residents, from members of the public. And yes, the report that you see in front of you is the final report that's been produced. I think it's worth noting the work that went into this report. So 13,000 residents were contacted with a mail out to invite them to provide input into the report so that it covers as much of the impact as possible from the community. So we received 220 responses to that, detailed responses of magnitude of the event. So on the call as well, so on the screen joining remotely is Anna Beasley. So Anna is from JBA Consulting. Anna was the project manager on the report. So her and her team helped compile information from residents, from stakeholders, to get interviews with internal colleagues, with Water, to try to bring that information together. So yeah, it was instrumental in pulling the contents together. I think it's worth noting broadly what the report includes at this stage, and then what I'll do is I'll open for questions more about the general principles of the investigation and the report, because we can go into, as you mentioned, go into specifics later. So broadly covers a summary of the stakeholder engagement, what activities, what individuals and what organisations were consulted. It goes into a little bit of information about the quirks of the drainage and of instances in Chelsea, how the borough drains and how that leads to the risk of flooding in certain areas. It goes into the history of flooding, so it documents the impact in 2007 that many residents remember, and may have been affected again, or may have neighbours who are affected again. So it goes into detail in that. It also goes through the roles and responsibilities of the different organisations, the different bodies. It sets out the flood risk management activities, and we'll discuss more of those later. It goes through the actual event itself, the rainfall, gives some details about what the event, what led to the event, what rainfall led to the event, and where it was located. It goes into the response to the incident. It goes into the impact on the community, the impact on individuals, and then finally it goes to recommendations. That's broadly what the contents of the report covers in the investigation. So, yeah, if there are any questions at this stage, more about the process and about the report as a whole, yeah, we work on it.
I have a question, because you mentioned you spoke with the members of the public, including residents and businesses, and there are some home visits. I couldn't find really a figure how many properties actually are visited.
In terms of the site, yeah. So in terms of direct visits to properties, I visited approximately 7 or 8 properties, going into the residents' property, showing them but I was also shown from residents in those communities around the local area, and they were able to give accounts of where the flooding originated, which other properties were affected.
Between 7 and 6, there are businesses or just like property, private properties, residential houses?
Those are just private residents, and that was only as part of the investigation. It doesn't mean to say that council officers didn't attend as part of the response to the flooding event. I know that particularly our business and economic department visited a number of the businesses along Portobello Road in the immediate aftermath. There were lots of site visits in the immediate aftermath.
My question was not particularly you as a person. In general, how many visits were conducted? There's about 300 houses on Shropshire were affected, so I just really want to know percentage of someone, one whole person, and seeing the damage taken for this yourself as an expert.
Yeah, so we don't have records of every property that was visited by any council official. Partly because there's the investigation process often happens later after the immediate event, and during the immediate event there are other respondents like the fire brigade, like Thames Water themselves, and as well as our council emergency response function. So in the immediate aftermath, it's not the responsibility of council officers to visit and document in that immediate response.
Did you have any request from the residents, please come and see?
Yes, and I know that councillors visited individual properties, and officers did attend those properties. What we don't have is exact records of individual properties that were attended at the time of the immediate aftermath.
Can't bring in.
Just ask, in the report, you mentioned that 700 people have contacted the MP. It's very disappointing return, 13,000 approaches in the year 2020. Have we gone back through the MP to those 700 and said, would you feed into this report?
Yeah, so we contacted the MP's office to request even a summary of the addresses or the number of properties on each street. We haven't been provided that information. I know
the other way around, whereby you give the MP's office an email to send to the 700 to say, can you get in touch directly?
For follow up. Yeah, so we notified the MP and JV were involved in that process, had a meeting to say that this investigation is in process. I think there were restrictions in what contact could be made to residents that had provided a response to them because of GDPR in terms of what response can be made. But I know that Anna had a meeting with the MP to go through our investigation process and where information could fit into that. We're doing the same with Thames Water, so we weren't able to share individual property level information with Thames Water. But what we have done is gone back to residents who reported to us and notify them that they need to fill in a form and report directly to Thames Water. I mean, flood reporting is something that is noted in the Section 19 report as an area that needs to be tidied up and done. That's a national picture because there's a need to report to the council, which leaves local authority to investigate. There's also the need, if it's sewer flooding, to report directly to Thames Water. We can't easily share information. And then there's also its representations and there's no mechanism to carry it. So that's a recommendation and a learning lesson for everyone. And that's not a local picture, that's a national picture. Because the last thing a resident wants to do, or a business wants to do, is fill in 4 different forms to 4 different organisations, just for the different investigations that are in the process. But unfortunately, we have a duty. We can't just rely on the information that's provided to us by other organisations because of data protection restrictions.
Do you have numbers from Thames Water Woodlands? Do we have?
Yeah, so we have a data sharing agreement with Thames Water. So we were able to receive the exact property numbers from Thames Water. So our estimate, so in the report, the estimate of 340, at least 340 properties is a result of the 220 that were reported to us, some internal council properties that we were aware of, plus the properties that reported to Thames Water that didn't necessarily report to us. So that's a bigger picture than just the ones that filled in the form to us. So we have Thames Water's records, and that fed into the number that's reported.
We'll have another question. From your report, it's clear from history that 7-Eleven happened in 2007.
Mhm.
And in 2021, last year, we had 300 households affected, and 2007, over 500. So my question is simple. Why we haven't really predicted this to happen again, taking into consideration the global warming and how people suffer? And why we haven't done more?
Yes, and I mean that's quite a broad question, and it's something that the council has raised repeatedly, particularly with Thames Water, over the years in 2007 to now, particularly regarding the proposals that have come since then with the Towns's Creek storm relief sewer. So there have been plans in place to reduce the risk of flooding to more properties. Since that point, many properties have been protected through the works that Thames Water have implemented. And it's a relatively small number of properties that have had those measures installed that flooded in the summer event last year. So it's likely that without any of that work that Thames Water completed to reduce the risk of flooding, it's likely that many more properties would have flooded last year. In terms of climate change and in terms of those measures, particularly with the sewer network, that's maybe best placed with the session about Thames Water and the independent review. They did a lot more analysis on modelling and what measure that they looked back at other measures that, like the Thames Creek storm, that could have been implemented as a hypothetical issue. So what we've tried to do in this report is not duplicate what the independent review was looking at, but try to look into the areas that we have control over and look into what the responsibility to the council is for this.
I would like to the last question. On page 10 of your report, it says here climate change is likely to increase the frequency and intensity of events. So obviously, this is everybody knows that water level in Thames will go higher up, and this will create more flooding coming from Thames itself, right? So I just would like to know how we can prepare for that, because this is possibility happening on our doorstep.
Yeah, so the River Thames is covered under, so in terms of tidal and fluvial flooding from the River Thames, that's covered under a separate strategy, which is called the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. So it's and that's managed by the Environment Agency, implemented locally by the council. So that mechanism is separate from this process, but there is a plan in place to raise defences between now and the year 2100 in accordance with the expected increases in sea levels as a result of climate change. So that's a separate plan, and that's a separate process, but it's all related to the potential climate change.
But would you not implement it in your strategy as a part of?
So it will form so because the council isn't responsible for main river and tidal flooding, that's the responsibility of the Environment Agency as the overall body in the Flooding Water Management Act. All we need to do is make sure that our strategy, our local flood risk strategy, and plans of the local plan, other council plans align with the aims of that strategy, and don't contradict.
But you do work together.
Absolutely.
Right, just to quickly go back to the stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
You mentioned that 13,000, I think was the
Yes.
13,000 residents were engaged. Just wondered if you could give an overview as to how those were selected. Was it even across the affected wards?
Yeah, so that was focused into areas where we knew they were likely to have been affected, either because of the rainfall, so maybe it's just because those were the areas. What we didn't do is go to individual streets and say that side, not consulted that side. So it was more broad brush in those areas, but it was related to the areas where we already knew there had been properties affected. It was also sent out to our consultation portal to everyone registered on that consultation portal. So it was done through our plan consultation for a fixed window. So yeah, it was localized in broad areas. What we're doing now is going through the process of creating a form that residents, as soon as the flood happens, they can report flooding through the website straight away. It doesn't involve the need to have that consultation, and that will help in terms of residents in advance being able to know where they should be linked to where they should report, so that it simplifies that process of them to invest as much time in getting the message out.
Is that going to have a broad brush data protection thing that you can share it with
Yes.
anybody?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah, so that's clear about.
just as a follow-up, I did wonder if you shared any, and presumably not, because you gave the answer earlier, but able to share any data in terms of water.
So all we were
Back the other way.
Yeah, so we were able to share the summary of the number of properties per street. So they were able to look at. And
So I think, sorry to interrupt, but clearly the engagement is really important. It's going to residents didn't agree that, particularly when it comes to terms of water engagement, it's been lackluster across the board. So I think it's really important that residents are confident that they've been able to feed into this report. What specifically in terms of, you said there was a mailing, is there one mailing? How hard have we tried to get in touch with people?
There was one, I think there was one mailing in advance of the consultation that went out to those 13,000. The window was open for a couple of weeks, I think, two or three weeks for residents to respond.
Are you satisfied we can learn that?
Yeah, and I think if we were contacted after that point, through other means, through other internal contacts, which there have been, probably between 10 15 residents after that point who come forward. We sent, please fill in this a copy of the form for them to be able to provide those representations to us. Thames Water have done themselves some targeted campaigns, again dropped letters in individual areas. They're finding it very difficult to get responses back in some areas. So we recently received a list from them of properties they believe to have either flooded or the model shows they should have potentially been affected. So that the council can assist in that. I think we've done other things like having the website, and the website's being updated regularly to show these are the steps you need to take, these are the reporting mechanisms. And that's been broadly communicated. With flooding, there's generally known to be underreporting to authorities and organisations, partly because of the number of reports that need to happen, but also because of potential concerns over insurance premiums or concerns over the use of that information. So
I'm skipping ahead. Sorry. So if I just make one more point, skipping ahead slightly, because I was going to read it further on. It seems a good time since we've gone on to that. I know in your in this report, Albion Crescent on the streets in London badly affected.
Yeah.
A number of properties suffered, and yet only 3 reported.
Yes.
I mean, do you think, without your words in your mouth, do you think prior experience, with a lack of real engagement on the part of the authorities that matter, has caused people to have a lack of faith in reporting? It's not just an insurance issue, but also just a lack of faith generally about whether things are actually fixed.
Yeah, I think there partly could be that. I think there's also the issue if residents haven't been affected previously, they may not be aware, even if they've received a letter. They may have received a letter if we didn't have another, and they may not have been in the property. So I know residents who tried to be contacted by Thames Water, but a letter's been posted through the door, and they're not in that residence because it's being refurbished or it's vacant because it needs to be cleaned. So there's partly the knowledge of what actually needs to happen after an event and what needs to happen. But as you say, with various organisations and the split between the council or Thames Water or other organisations, it makes it quite difficult for residents to work to and businesses to be able to know what reporting needs to do or should happen.
One question from me in general about the report. In terms of the legislation, we're obliged to produce the Section 19 report. To whom does it need to be formally sort of presented? For example, is it supposed to be presented to government for a response? Is there anything set out in terms of what happens to the report?
No, so it's a little bit unclear in the legislation, specifically around this section. So all it mentions is we need to notify any other risk management authorities. So risk management authorities is other organisations who have responsibility for different sources of funding, so Thames Water, Environment Agency, ourselves. So we just need to notify them and publish the results. In other sections of the Flood and Water Management Act, so for instance, we have to report an asset register that needs to be available for the minister to inspect at any time. So there's no central reporting to government. We don't need to notify central government about the fact that we undertook an investigation, the fact that we published an investigation. So it's a little bit unclear in that sense. And the recommendations aren't binding recommendations in the legislation.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, there was a pick-up on that in terms of, do we think we've actually got this report out and about with residents? Do you think they know about it? And I would certainly say, I saw a flurry of emails yesterday I spoke about the working group, people know about it, and also presumably they're not totally knowledge of that. So what are we now doing in terms of positive steps to get it out there with the residents so that they can import, or indeed they can come into future meetings?
Yeah, so in terms of the report, so in advance of the publication of the report, I notified every resident that's reported directly to us as part of this process that their contributions will be included in the findings of the report. So that was the 200. So those are the ones that are most directly affected that were reported directly to us. I also share the information, so we have a circulation list, residents and the steering group, so they representatives on that often have connections with the wider communities, and so it was shared with that group. I think it's difficult outside of a flooding event, one year long, to be able to engage quite well with members of the community that weren't necessarily affected. But I think in terms of, so residents will also received information from the GLA, the basement leaflet. As part of that, we haven't been directly contacted, but it may have led those residents to look at the website. And the website has a lot of information in terms of engagement. But
We sent the MP a link to our office to send it to someone.
yes, so I had a meeting 2 weeks ago to discuss, and I shared the results of the report, linked to the report into the
Well, it sounds to me that improved data sharing, improved reporting, direct reporting are common threads that come out of this, and I suspect they'll come up again in future ones. Are there any further general questions? I think, Jane,
I have just one. Yes, on page 90, you mentioned about sites. I just wanted to know from 2007, 2022, do you have a number how many rain gardens has been set, how many plants, how biodiversity has been encouraged within the borough, how many trees were planted in affected areas to remove flooding effects?
I mean, we've given examples of the projects that have been implemented since 2007. So there's some highway schemes that the council led. There are some park schemes. So there's the Holland Park rain garden within the playground area, as well as our gardens project that was led by Thames Water.
Would you produce some kind of a brochure to give to the residents to encourage them?
Yeah, so there's a website that's been launched. There's a link on the council's flooding page. So there's a new flooding page that collects everything together to do with flooding. And so if a resident types in flooding, they go straight to that. So as part of that, there's a story map that's being produced. So it gives a high level overview of what SUDs are, and it goes through the schemes that have been implemented by the council, the committed schemes that will be delivering in the coming years, and also opportunities. It also gives some advice about what residents could potentially do if they are wanting to reduce their personal contribution from their property to the risk of flooding in the area. So that's available. I can go through that in more detail at the subsection.
For the public for today, there is no such brochure. Crisis living available citizen advice. We don't have a brochure for today, literally encouraging people, whoever has a garden or a plot of land, to be aware that this green garden can help with reducing the flooding effect. So don't you think it's better that council will make one account with their residents, when some residents are not good with computers and are finding it difficult? Even for today's meeting, I tried to find and encourage someone to go online. I couldn't find the link to today's meeting. I couldn't find literature. Literally today, and we're meeting 6 o'clock. Can you see how difficult it is for residents to access that? So I don't believe that waiting for people to come to you in a time of crisis when not everybody takes biology lessons and understands the topography of London of our borough. I think it's quite wise to put extra money when we save somewhere else, to make this brochure and to come to the residents and make them more aware this will happen and this is available. This can make it a little bit easier for you.
I will pick this up in section 4 because I think there's a we want to discuss this as well. Councillors doing how we can manage risk in the future. Obviously, we'll have entire meeting stance as well. So maybe there's a lot there as well. In that case, James and Anna, would you like to present the reports on July?
Yes. Yeah, I'll go through the headlines that the report summarises. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. And yeah, Anna, is there and anything you want to drop in as well? Go through. So one thing to note for the July event, the report summarises is that there was a yellow warning of rain for the time that the flooding occurred. But the yellow warning of rain covers an area stretching all the way from Devon to Suffolk. Within that area, there's a chance of rain leading to surface water flooding in the local area. So it's worth knowing that was the context in which we were developing. So one of the outcomes of the report is that the return period, or the probability of the rainfall, varied really significantly. So in the north of the borough, around Lofton Hill and North Kensington, the return period was a 1 in 185-year event. So that's every year there's a chance of it occurring about 0.5%. Whereas in Chelsea, in the south of the borough, there's a 1 in 2 year event. So every year there's a 50% chance of that rainfall of that magnitude occurring. So even across the borough, there's a significant split north to south about where the rainfall hit. So it was incredibly localized. And the report also provides a bit of context outside of the borough and shows that there was basically the rain fell in a strike from Hammersmith to Hampstead. So then all the way across Hammersmith to Fulham, parts of Chelsea, parts of Westminster and Camden. So it was incredibly localised in the borough, but actually quite widespread across parts of Central. The conclusion of the report is that the flooding is caused by extreme rainfall, incredibly extreme rainfall, falling on the urbanised catchment. But it also notes that it was made worse by high tide levels in the River Thames. So high tide in the River Thames occurred at basically the same time, approximately the same time as the highest rainfall. So those times are noted in the report. And it says that it's likely that it can contribute to factor. The evidence in the Section 19 report also shows that a significant number of properties were affected along streets where there is a trunk sewer or a storm relief sewer. So there's a table set out in Section 9 which says where the trunk sewers are, where the storm relief sewers are, and the streets that fall along that section. And it concludes that basically in that local area and in the wider area, the local sewer network, trunk sewer network, and the storm relief sewer network were entirely full through that section. And it goes into quite a lot of detail about each of those areas, each of those locations. It also says in terms of the flooding event, the intensity of the rainfall such, and the fact that the sewer network was basically at capacity, that any concerns around block gullies or the highway drainage network wouldn't have made any difference because of the intensity of the rainfall being of such magnitude, and also the fact that where those gullies drain to, the sewer network was almost entirely at capacity over much of the area that was affected. I just want, on that point, I want to note that a lot of those outcomes are mirrored in the stage 4 report and what the stages 1 to 4 report of the independent. I know we're discussing that separately, but it's worth to note at this stage that a lot of the findings are equivalent, particularly regarding the sewer network in the local area. It says about Kensington and Chelsea, and specifically mentions that in the stage 4 report. And it mentions that the highway drainage network. So that's the broad summary of the kind of rainfall event and what led to flooding. Anna, is there anything else you wanted to add just from that section?
Oh, I think you've covered it very nicely there, James. Thanks.
Okay, I might start with one or two questions on this. In terms of the sewers, then, how do we know for sure that they were full? Sort of measurement instruments or otherwise, presumably paying towards it, and at disposal to be able to tell. And second, how full are the sewers on a typical day? 100% to 0%. What's an average?
Yeah, so in terms of the information that we have available to us, we don't have the monitoring information in terms of the ads on the sewer. So we know that the storm relief sewers were full and surcharging because of the evidence provided by residents, because of the evidence provided in media reports, videos that have been uploaded by residents. It's useful, we're in an age where you can take a video and straight away put it on social media. We did a sweep of that as part of the investigation to get that information. And we can see that we have a manhole completely fountain of water. There are photographs in the report showing that. And we know from the sewer records that those locations are on the storm relief sewer network. So those are the ones that are only activated when everything else is full, it spills into those. When those are the ones that are surcharging out and flooding the surface, it gives an indication. So we don't have access to the monitoring data. We don't have access to historic monitoring data of the sewer network to know how close it gets to flooding properties in any given year, or and how frequently or how close near these events have happened in the past.
In other words, all the conclusions that have been drawn in section 2 sewers have actually been drawn without knowledge that Thames Water has.
Yeah,
even though we've come at it from a very different angle, using independent information to reach the same conclusion that the experts.
Yes. So one piece of evidence that we did have in terms of is the historic reports of flooding. So some of those are tabulated in section 4 to say that in 2016 there were properties I know in Rock Square that were affected by flooding, and so 2016, 2018. But all we have is the number of reports in that area. I believe those weren't notified to us to be able to, investigate further, because there's no requirement for Thames Water to notify us as the local flood authority that they had even one report of flooding to them. So yes, it's essentially been based on the visual evidence, the anecdotal evidence, and the reports of flooding that Thames Water have available to them.
Another incident of data sharing, how that can possibly be. It also strikes me as a sort of cruel irony that the storm relief sewers. And then open up to colleagues, Council.
There's mention here about pumps and various switch pumps on and one pump work. And then separately, they also talk about flooding suddenly disappearing, which on the timelines are not dissimilar. Or 15 minutes between. Can you talk more about that? Because we don't seem to draw any conclusions about whether the pumps were significant in reducing the flooding, or indeed had they been working, whether they might have had a significant impact. Yeah,
so this is the difficulty that we have. We don't have access to detailed modeling information to be able to run multiple scenarios through to be able to determine what impact one would have on another. What we wanted to provide in the report was evidence of the experiences that we provided and evidence that we've been sort of timing things and some of the specific conditions that we've been given by Thames Water about when the pumps were switched on. So the one thing we weren't able to do is directly link those together. It's covered in more detail by the independent review. In terms of the possible impact of a delay in turning on the pumps at Box Road by however long it was from the also the manual operation failure of one of the pumps at Smith pumping station that was considered separate. They show in that report, they show that there was there was an impact on the water, the kind of global water levels in the sewer. It was a minor. But the other experience that I've been told by many residents is the fact of the flood water reducing so rapidly. There are other causes to that that could potentially that could have potentially caused that reduction in terms of just the way the network functions. So it could be the pumps clearing out the storm relief sewer, and then that kind of opened up capacity, and the experience of basement level is reduced. But the timings indicate, and which is what we wanted to show in the report, the timings indicate that it was at a similar time the activation of the pumps and the evidence from the residents with the flood water received. What we don't know is if when the pumps are turned on, how long it takes to drain the network so that the resident or the saw that reduction to be able to show that if the pump switched on at this time and the network's full, it therefore will propagate up the network to a reduction. We just simply don't have that information to be able to say that. It tends all to have more of that information available, which is why the independent review went into more detail about that.
Explain to us a little bit, I bet I'm listening from home stuff, what exactly these pumps are, how often they're supposed to be used, who manages them, information.
Yeah, so they are Thames Water's pumps. So the two main pumps, there's one main pumping station in the borough, so that's at Lotts Road, down the south of the borough. And there's another pumping station that affects the network locally, which is at Hammersmith pumping station. I think it's quite close to Hammersmith Road, but they're owned and operated by Thames Water. Their main function is if the water, I suppose they have multiple functions. One of which is if the tide level in the River Thames is high, and therefore the system can't drain by gravity into the River Thames, the pumps are activated to allow to kind of force water through the valve into the River Thames. So if the water level if the water level in the River Thames was a very low tide, the modelling undertaken by the independent review showed that there would have been quite a significant impact, a reduction, a betterment in particularly in Kensington, Chelsea, and Hammersmith, because of the proximity to the stations.
But because there was a high tide.
Because there was a high tide. Yes, it was. So therefore, the whole system was reliant on the pumps to get the water out of the network. It may be something that we discussed later in one of the other sessions, but the independent review looked at whether if you close the Thames barrier and therefore forced to low tide, whether that would have it concluded that it would have made an impact, it would reduce the risk of flooding. However, the certainty and the lead time to be able to close the Thames barrier wasn't there, and I don't believe it to be a viable flood risk management option, particularly for a summer event when there's a warning that across such a large area. So if it was a low tide, the impact across the line would have been lessened.
Yes, I have a question. More or less about it says here, engage and scrutinize the findings of the Thames Water independent review. So actually, you have as a royal board, this is very clear, it says in progress, ability to engage with Thames Water and scrutinize the findings. My question was another on top of it. How do you do that? And do you know the time on 12th of July last year when the fires were activated, how they were activated, are they man operated or run some kind of automatic pilot?
Yeah, so that's in section. Well, I find this section of it. So all the timings of the activation are listed in the report for each of the pumps. For Lots Road, they're manually activated. For Hammersmith, they are automatically activated. In terms of the scrutiny of the London Flood Review, so at each stage we provided a response back, a commentary response back to the review, and we can discuss potentially those responses at the session about the flood review. We're expecting further engagement even after the publication of the stage 4 report, as well as this forum. We're expecting officer engagement with the flood review, because some of the recommendations are for us as the council, as a local flood authority. So that's the mechanism we'll do that, and we can discuss those. Oh yes, sorry, it's table 8.1 is the Lots Road.
Last question, do you have any cooperation with Hammersmith and Fulham, since some pipes are here, some pipes are there, but do you more or less have more?
Absolutely, yeah, so we've been coordinating for a response to the London Flood Review. We've been having officer level meetings with Camden, Westminster, Hammersmith and Fulham, and South and Chelsea, because we're basically it's the same sewer network. It's integrated. We've been providing independent comments, but we've been coordinating on discussing the outcomes, discussing the learning. It's been very much a coordinated officer level level response.
Do you agree on recommendations for Thames Water?
Yes, and there are some that are local. So particularly the stage 2 report, there are locally specific hotspots and things like that. In terms of the overview, in advance of the stage 4 report, we received a draft of the stage 4 report to be able to provide comments back. And so we will also coordinate Pan London through the London Drainage Engineers Group as well.
I ask because working in Hammersmith before, you see more biodiversity, more plants, more pollinators, more trees planted. So this is why I ask, how do you cooperate with them? Because you may understand that you will just literally do the same in our area.
Yes, and we're all, each of the boroughs are very conscious that for an event like this, we can't solve everything just in our boundary, because water's coming from Camden into Stormwater and we're conscious that there needs to be that cross boundary. I suppose the final session of the working group, that'll be a good opportunity to discuss those broader cross boundary issues.
That's great.
Just one question, if I may, on the sub, so I don't want to go into too much detail because I know we've got another session on. I think it's quite evident that as a local authority we need to do whatever we can to prepare for in the future. The report notes specifically that you've got a number of sub schemes currently in design stages in various council departments. I just wondered whether you thought that there were sort of any delays there, and if so, or blockage was, and where we can sort of fix that. How quickly we can get those?
I think in the schemes that are in the pipeline, I don't see there to be delays in terms of more kind of speeding up the implementation.
Sorry, I should have rephrased my question. Speeding up rather than fixing them.
Yes, in terms of speeding up and also increasing the scale. One of the biggest impacts, one of the biggest constraints is the routes to access funding. So we're able to access funding from the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. The process to do that is relatively long, relatively extensive. So we've been successful in the Portobello Port Estates and Sustainable Drainage Scheme, so it's a retrofit. sustainable drainage scheme in a housing estate. But it's been going through the approvals process with the Environment Agency for quite some time because of the evidence you need to provide. Again, that's not a local issue. That's a national issue, particularly for surface water flooding. Schemes aren't, the funding mechanisms aren't set up to be able to justify that funding as into. So there are calls across England to simplify the process for surface water flooding, where it's less easy to justify the properties of risk of flooding or the properties that may benefit from something like a sustainable drainage. And Anna, I think you can provide like a bit more of a wider context about that. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, the one time I do speak. Yeah, no, what you said is absolutely true. Across England, it's quite difficult to access flooding coastal erosion risk management funding for surface water flooding because it's difficult to demonstrate the economic benefits, partly because the flooding tends to be shallower than fluvial and tidal flooding, and therefore the kind of monetary benefits of protecting those properties is less obvious. And so it's difficult. It's quite a strict funding structure where you have to demonstrate a cost-benefit ratio, and surface water flooding schemes tend to not be able to meet those requirements as easily as say river and tidal flooding, and that's something that as consultants we've seen with local authorities all over the country really trying to get surface water risk management schemes off the ground through that funding mechanism. So for SUDS and SUDS retrofit, people are looking a bit wider in terms of funding mechanisms and trying to harness those multiple benefits that you mentioned, and look for funding through other streams, not just in terms of flood risk benefit, but the other benefits that they would bring in terms of amenity, biodiversity, and funding streams related to those, health and well-being as well, and trying to exploit those other funding streams as well.
But it doesn't mean to say that we haven't accessed that funding and we haven't looked at other funding sources to be able to deliver it. But funding in general is just is one of the benefits, and I think particularly with flooding so widespread in recent memory, I found from communities and residents that weren't necessarily even themselves directly affected, there's much more buy-in to implement schemes or look at sustainable drainage.
It strikes me if we're essentially anticipating more of these sorts of surface level flood events, climate change, possibly increased rainfall events like we saw last year, then it strikes me then that whole funding mechanism actually needs to be changed substantially so it's easier to access funding for local authorities, for property owners. That's another conversation, to be able to make these sorts of changes. Because as you mentioned, Anna, possibly easier to access funding for tidal river flooding because it was almost a given for a very, very long time. That's where the funding would come from. But if actually in urban areas, that's something we can no longer take for granted.
It's worth saying that DEFRA are revising, or they're starting to look at revising the kind of criteria for assessing schemes and basing it more on kind of resilience rather than just economic damages. So that's a positive move, but that's going to take probably is going to be 5 years before that's really coming into force.
We have Royal Broadcasting Jesse has a new policy of air quality. And we have this city living, I just double check that complex, I mean, for city living local life. And one of the requirements is that if someone wants to apply for greening own space, can apply on the air quality, more or less. If you plant more trees, more shrubs, your whole biodiversity. I gathered that literally this year, somewhere in March, Mayor of London, he offered £4 million again for greening London. So funding it's out there. It's just a matter of making people aware of it and how to apply for that. So once again, I know there's another session for that, but I think it doesn't hurt to really put your mind together now, prepare this kind of leaflet and get it out. If you don't go door to door, at least leave it in the local libraries. Someone is back and pick it up and read the one. The funding is out there. It's just a matter to make people more aware.
Can I ask a couple of unrelated questions? First of all, page 31, you talk about planning application having been put in for a pumping station at Queen. What happened to that? Secondly, the concept of sweeping gullies. What I noticed, rain, you hit the bottom of the hill, and all rubbish goes to the bottom of the hill and block gullies. Is there any science to actually whether actually we cleared out some of those gullies on the way that might have helped? A third question, to try and get my head around this concept of South Borough has a 1 to 2 year possibility, whereas actually, if I read your report, you're saying that all those problems that were hit in July last year should not be hitting it for another 170 odd years, and therefore they all should be inside the league. You shouldn't see a premium talking about. That's the ultimately the question. But to me, I still want to get my head around it because actually, those people who are sitting beautifully closely down in Chelsea or else actually are more likely to be hit by flooding. And actually, this debate is for their benefit as much as for people who were hit last year.
Yes, in terms of so if I answer your second question first. Your third question, yes. So yes, in terms of the complacency and the reasons for flooding in those areas. Yes, you're right. If the rainfall was small amount to the south and the east, different properties would have been affected. And properties in those areas were affected in 2007. It was a much more extensive event. There is, however, the difference, particularly in, along the path of the County Creek Sewer, which is some of the strong belief sewers. Actually, those, even if rain didn't fall on those areas, they could potentially be a risk of sewer flooding as well. So it's not necessarily that they're only reliant on the rain falling directly on them. And also, particularly with climate change, particularly with the changes we're seeing recently in the past 10 to 15 years. What we class now as a 185 year event is based on information that was collated up to 2013 by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology based on the record up to that date. But then, if you then repeatedly receive intense rainfall events of that magnitude, and then you redo the calculations, that 185 becomes a 100, which then maybe in 5 years' time, when you look back, that becomes a 130. So it's all based on probability. So as far as we know at the moment, looking at the history, the chance of occurring is 5%. But it doesn't mean to say that it won't happen next year.
Statistically, doesn't that actually, next year is already 9 years out of date?
Yes.
So statistically, is it not help? It's not helping residents to be talking about it being a 1 in 165 year event, when actually, we've probably redone this figures from 2013 and already down to 1 in 150 years.
I think what it does do is show the kind of the significant difference between the intensity of rainfall in the north and south of the borough and how extreme that rainfall is. I'm not saying that it will happen to that magnitude every year, and there is a lot of that happens in there that we choose to produce that. But it's based on the information that's available now, and it benchmarks it against elsewhere in the country, because there's a big, the rainfall figures are national.
Presumably, we're in the longest drought since 1976, so presumably when this breaks, it has to by its nature, because the ground is going to be too hard to absorb. And you know, we need to be ready and set up.
Yes.
With the water.
So we
for
have.
me to talk about hundreds of years for people, actually gives you a false sense of protection that this is a one-off event, whereas so I appreciate the amount of rain, but actually we are in a dry summer and it's going to be happening in somewhere. Whether it's our borough or it's another borough, I don't know.
Yeah, I think what the report doesn't do is say, well, there was a 185 event locally. So there's nothing we can do to be better prepared to bring again. So I think it doesn't minimise the impact, and it doesn't minimise the expectations to be able to respond. Because if we can improve for this event, the warning that's available to residents, maybe perhaps we should move on to some of the recommendations. But actually, if there's a 1 in 30 event that may affect a smaller number of properties, but we can provide them with more information for that, then actually there's benefit overall. And it's just that this is the first investigation that the council's had to do under the 2010 legislation. So, but you're correct that getting the message across about the magnitude of the event, whether it's a chance of occurring term period, it's very difficult to digest, and it's very difficult to know. I know that Carlisle had it had a 1 in 200 year event or something like that, and then the following year, or quite soon after, had 1,000 year event based on the rate of the expected rainfall. So it then waters down what it actually means, and again, it's an issue that's more widely discussed in risk management, but there's no necessarily correct answer.
It is a difficult concept to communicate to people, and one that hydrologists wrestle with quite constantly. And we are now trying to use, as James said, the terms, a chance of happening each year, rather than a 1 in 185 year return period, i.e. it's only going to happen every 1 in 185 years. So there's, we try to get the messaging across, but it's quite a difficult concept, and it's important to try and communicate that, as you say, to residents in a way that doesn't make it seem like it's not going to happen again for a long time.
Even though the statistics may say it's 1 in 185 years, it doesn't mean it can't happen again next year.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just probabilities, as James said. Yeah.
I'm very puzzled, sorry if I didn't come across as a ignorant. We were struck by one thing which I couldn't understand. The development of basements contributes to how much flooding. Physically, I cannot say how. Can you explain to me? Because obviously, all of our present treaty has many applications for development of basements. So I really want to see how this contributes. It actually allows someone to have a bigger space, but at the same time, the person is flooded and the neighbor is flooded. I cannot see how this gets activated. Let's say that.
Yeah, so there's no evidence that the development of basements has contributed to the flooding. I don't think it's.
I mean, if you moved another question.
Yeah, if you find it, you find a reference. Yeah, so it may be that.
Planning.
Yeah, so there are inherently within the urban makeup of Kensington, more basements, more existing basements than other areas. So therefore, there are more residents at risk of flooding from the sewer because of the mechanism going into the lower ground floor and the basement and the existing basements. And often they're within the existing terraces in these areas. We're not aware of basements that were newly constructed that were affected by flooding. We were quite strict on policies about the measures that residents need to put in place to prevent those basements from flooding. And also with the mechanism for rain falling on the ground surface. There was no indication that it percolated into the ground and caused groundwater flooding in a significant number of areas. The speed at which it went over the surface into the sewer, the predominant mechanism was from the sewer itself.
Surely there is a learning here for planning as well, isn't there? Because a lot of properties now are being renovated to a good standard, but people with very small outside yards, they're choosing to do away with glass or any form of natural anywhere where the water can go. So it's just standard. Is there any consideration that
So we have probably the strictest policies in the whole of London in terms of planning, and particularly for minor developments, so extensions, not necessarily the big new multiple flats or close developments. So any minor development and including household development need to reduce the contribution from the whole site, or the whole of the area by 50%. So often that involves properties doing a rear extension, having to put attenuation, having to put green roofs on, having to put rain gardens to reduce their contribution. So in terms of our planning policy, to be relatively strict on that, and those reviews come from me as well. So when we're looking at when applicants are coming forward to develop, and so as part of that, we're looking at the whole site, the whole area is effective, and we've got policies to resist new and permanent surface in gardens that come forward as part of planning applications. There are some limited development rights, which means that we don't have controls over some aspects of, for instance, the creation of impermeable surface that doesn't require planning application in a rear garden. We don't have control over that. We do over the front gardens. There's separate legislation about the creation of large impermeable surfaces in the front garden.
I think just sort of highlighted one of the properties that my ward colleague and I visited in November last year with Thames Water was a particularly important one to look at because they had just redone their basement. And outside in the back garden had completely paved it over. I think they acknowledged that a large part of it might not necessarily stopped the water coming in. It probably just would have slowed it down, but it might slow it down enough for them to act. And the surface water was just there and collected in a matter of sort of it's really. And I think there was some realization that they too had contributed in ways through their design of the property to the problem they had. I think it's probably not much to do in terms of planning, as you say.
Yeah, and what we are doing at the moment is, you probably know that the local plan is being reviewed, revised at the moment. In there, it's strengthening and clarifying some of those policies. So surface water management has been separated out from forest management, so that there's more information, there's more clarity about what the expectations are, and there'll be more guidance available with the greening. So we published last July a greening supplementary planning document, which goes into the measures that individual residents can implement themselves on their properties for greening surfacing. But yeah, it's partly an education, and it does, particularly where there isn't a planning application required. We don't necessarily want it to be them flooding. It's almost flooding itself on the surface for them to have, for residents to understand and to realise what steps they can do.
Am I correct that you have to do a flood risk assessment on your own property, but you do it for your neighbouring property if you're doing basement? And actually, is that something that you should consider expanding?
So flood risk assessment, by definition, includes the flood risk to a property, and also the potential impact on the flood risk elsewhere. So you're not just looking at whether your property will flood. It's looking at, as a result of the construction, whether there's a potential impact on the flood risk elsewhere.
Chances are, if you put in a valve or a pump, I think it says it in this report, that will protect you, but it may just pass the problem on to the next property. Where is the requirement that you actually fit, for example, those things to your neighbours if you increase the chance of flooding by putting on your own? Is this something we should think about or have?
No, so this is the, so if, say an application comes forward for a new basement below an existing property, requires a flood risk assessment. We also require a pump device from the drainage network so that that property doesn't flood from the sewer. That pump device is essentially a flip of everything themselves.
So they're protected.
They're protected, but also there wasn't that basement to flood from that property. So there's no, so we're not asking for every property with an existing basement to put in the devices. If there's development below ground for a creation of a new basement, those properties need to protect themselves. So we're not losing any volume of storage because that property wouldn't have flooded. That basement wouldn't have flooded because it didn't exist.
I'm thinking the neighbours because I'm protected. I built my basement, I've got my fit valve, my pump, but I potentially just passed the problem down the street.
Well, so there wouldn't have been.
But somebody may have a basement that's been there for years. Somebody
Yes.
because of the flip valve, it's pumping it somewhere else, and so it isn't a creation problem. It doesn't have to be the immediate neighbour. I mean, the report talks, and I know actually I would have talks up to visit, and I was chatting to them on the doorsteps as they were visiting properties, and they had said that yes, you flip valve on one property and cause the problem for the neighbours. So I am left with what are you doing to actually protect the neighbours when somebody comes up?
Just one point better, I think very personally, that we've got a lot of people in this borough that are asset rich but cash poor, and they've got basements that have lived in it and just said for a long time. We're pushing the problem along to them. I think that's very unfair. We live in a wealthy borough, a lot of people can afford to do these things, but we visited a lot of people that just simply did not have the funds available. I know we're going to come on to recommendations shortly.
Yeah, to answer your question, I think part of that is related to the rollout of flips items water and the identification of properties at risk of high risk of flooding and the measures that they put in place. So specifically related to the flooding last year in that area, Thames Water will do assessments and yes, you're right that locally, it's more that if multiple properties have flips installed, where there was basically that existing volume for the water to go, and one property doesn't, then there's a potential for that property to A, still flood, and B, potentially to a higher level. And that's why it's mentioned in the report that Arundel Gardens, the subsidy at Arundel Gardens was to provide some capacity in the network as a result of that. The installation flips us elsewhere. It's difficult in terms of development management because there's a limitation into the extent to which measures can be put into outside the property. So we're not asking for the existing below ground floor to be protected. It's more the creation of new basements where there wouldn't have been that space to flood during an event. So you're not reducing the volume, so therefore you're not pushing the impact as well.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be interested in taking away as a possibility with back by to see or indeed the conversation with Tim. Because actually it was part of the conversation they raised with me.
It wasn't, I mean, I remember when these first started, not a long time, but when they originally, when I think it was my understanding when they first started these films, they didn't give any indication that they would have any effect on anybody else. It seems to emerge during the last flood event where they sort of casually said, oh, well, actually, yeah, they can have effects. I was like, I didn't think that was the case. So we've been merrily going around. No, it doesn't have any effect on anybody else. So I do think it's something that they need to address, because clearly it's all very well, fitting themselves, but if that's actually, most people have got them and then one people hasn't, I think they've got a duty to say, well, if we made this property far more vulnerable to flooding. So I think they need to go around and actually identify the properties that don't have big holes and see the effect on those properties. But it's not something we can't do, obviously, because they're the ones that can be felt. So I do think it's something that's emerged out of this latest flood event that we weren't really aware of. That's definitely a conversation that came out of my visits with them as well. They were very sure that the problem was passed along, because it's going to find the probably the worst place, and also affect someone who hasn't got the financial means to be able to fit one themselves. I think it's clear that Thames Water, to fit these £130,000 each, we're way off trying to get any sort of solution from them, but it's clear that they're not going to have the money to be able to go fit one in every property that might be affected, and moreover, how you needs test it. But I think the point is that you're pushing it on to someone who is least capable of dealing with the problem.
If I may add one point to that, it's worth noting that in the independent review, there's one recommendation that Thames Water should be transparent about the decisions regarding flips, so which property gets them, which property doesn't. So I think that would help in terms of the decisions that are made about properties that don't currently have flips, that are adjacent to properties that do have them. So I think it will help. Because we don't have information about why properties weren't chosen for the
I think we've nicely moved on to section 4 on flood risk management. I'll come to you afterwards. It means fundamentally, at the end of the day, I think there was too much water physically. Just coming back to July as well, too much water, and water physically has to go somewhere, and it ended up in the sewer. That's what it was. So if we had that same amount of rainfall on tomorrow, the sequence of events broadly would be exactly the same. That amount of rainfall would still go into the sewer networks. Physically, that's still the same. And there's no reason to believe, possibly tide varying, there would still be flooding of some level. It's fundamentally the capacity just wasn't there. So I guess the question, we'd be talking about planning, floods and so on. Given that amount of rainfall, how much realistically, even if every pump had a pump, it was all greened over, would we still have a flood? I guess it's hard to answer, but given that amount of rainfall, that overwhelmed sewer network, all sort of scenes in the unthreatened experience thing, how much would you realistically have to do on the surface level to be able to mitigate that level? Is it possible, or is it fundamentally the case we need to extend the sewer network? Anything we do will be a bonus in the greening and sustainability, all good things. But I'm just conscious we don't want to be kidding ourselves to think we can do everything without fundamentally doing
Yeah, just in terms of the building or sewers, so since the report's been published, Thames Water have put out their draft drainage and wastewater management plan, for consultation. So that sets out Thames Water's strategy from 2025 to 2050, so 25-year plan. And as part of that process, they looked at specific networks and over the whole of the Thames area. Kensington Chelsea is one of their risk zones, so it's one of their priorities. And they've identified in there that larger sewers are required in that period. They've identified that thousands more properties will be at risk of sewer flooding or a 150 event or 130 event. So we're not even talking about the magnitude of the event that we had in July last year. Thousands more properties will be at risk of flooding. So they're going through the process of identifying the measures. But yes, so large sewers and sustainable drainage are the measures that over those 25 years, Thames Water themselves have identified that need to happen, and particularly in Kensington, Chelsea, Hammersmith, and Fulham local area. So we're not directly responsible for the size of the sewers, but in the next probably 12 months we'll update our local flood risk management strategy. So that's in the, and as part of that we'll do a look at what can happen and also what the council can do, what residents can do for themselves, and that will be consulted much more widely than this as well.
So things also around sewers.
Yeah.
I'll offer it to you and John to introduce them.
Section,
Yeah,
section 4 of the report. So, yeah, I can find that. Yeah, so conscious of time, so
yes, after the
yeah, so the report publishes the current project management activities. I'm not going to go through the list, but it's broadly about the documents that we have available, the measures that we've taken as part of that. It goes through the tidal offences, it goes through a bit more information about things like the council's big body regulations. Again, we can probably separate it out discussions about that for the Thames Water session. It also looks at the incident itself and goes through some of the incident response. Yeah, so I think the main focus of the project management activities is that we already have a strategy, we're implementing part of that strategy, but as a result of it being 6 years old now, we're revising that strategy, and also we need to revise the strategy because there's a new national strategy from the environment agency, and also as a result of the flooding, I think we're revising that. Because some of these themes that come out in section 19 report will feed into and directly influence what the priorities are in the revised local flood risk management strategy. So hopefully there'll be some continuity, some consistency to set that new direction forward. So we're not looking to just keep on implementing that plan of acceleration of certain aspects and a refocus given the time and given the event.
So I still want to come back to this question because I was puzzled, and obviously you are an expert, so I cannot see anybody here who really would answer, and obviously GP. So this is on your report, page 12, about basement developments, and it says here that we have the borough has long had the highest density of basement properties in UK, and in recent years there has been a trend to develop an extended basement. And it says here it's kind of a natural flow of groundwater. So I really want to know about that. And you have here a report by Exeter. So I would like to get a hard copy of this report, if it's possible.
Yes, so that report fed into our basements policy.
So can you elaborate?
I can probably answer basement.
Yeah.
We did do a lot of research at the time because a lot of people said that basements would cause additional flooding, partly because groundwater levels would go up.
But I mean, the analogy I could only give, and this is probably the wrong analogy, was almost like putting something very small into a bath of water, but it actually doesn't really affect groundwater levels. What it can affect is if there's an existing groundwater source, like a stream or groundwater, and a basement obviously hits that in some way, then of course there can be a diversion of underground water flow that can have an effect. But the basements themselves don't, and even we looked at it over a wide area, so we sort of said, well, okay, we can take a whole road, everybody puts in a basement, would that have an effect on groundwater? And, the hydrology report that we had commissioned said no. And so we had to, it was examined at some length, as some of the people in this room know. So the quick answer to your question is no. The basements themselves do not cause flooding, and there's no. I'm looking to my colleagues, but that was the hydrology reports that we've done at the time, and yeah, so that's the answer to your question.
Wouldn't you think basically that the bigger span, the more basement, the bigger absorption of water?
Sorry, so when we developed the policy and we restricted how far a basement could go under a garden area, we made sure that you have to provide a certain level of, at least a metre of subsoil on the top. So in terms of drainage and basements beneath gardens, we ensured that actually it wouldn't actually make it any worse. So in terms of drainage, although people might try and hard surface their garden, which we can't necessarily control because outside planning application, the actual basement itself didn't actually exacerbate any drainage issues because there was enough soil to percolate to make sure that the water percolating into the soil was slowed down, because you have to provide at least a metre of soil above the basement.
Do you have a data how many basements have been developed and how many basements has been affected? I just want to see something on paper. So more or less how many applications have been approved for this area, which is, let's say, on a flooding area, right? On this creek. Right. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you're saying.
How this more or less contributed towards over basement being flooded, including roads as well. I just want to see how this development and digging under can actually influence your flow of water, which is just here. And honestly, I'm just not prepared because I haven't seen that report. For me, it's easy to listen to you, then I can read the report and maybe I can later attribute our work.
Yeah. I mean, we can provide the report to you. You can read it, and obviously this question.
Because it's a part of the report, so I thought it would come together. Obviously, I couldn't find it on the website because there's nothing available. Even this wasn't scheduled that. So I would appreciate if you include for future reference whatever you refer to. So report it back to this session as well.
I would say is that within the planning applications, there are places that have mezzanine, where something is semi-underground already, and they're entitled to a basement already, but they may be centuries old, and so they will not be covered because that's only planning applications at a certain date. So you won't have a complete picture.
I still want to see the map of how the planning area is and how many rooms are on that. I just want to see the rest of it.
Well, we can supply you with the image. That's what I'm saying.
So I think that would be interesting.
I'm
to
just
see,
curious
certainly. Before we press on, I'm conscious we've got Ken and Gary who still isn't kind of thank you for your patience. So a lot to get through. I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about the gully cleaning programme and maybe some of your thoughts on how that could contribute to gully. So I know we touched on.
Yeah.
I see. Welcome to hear.
Well, the gully programme is broken into two parts. It's annually and it's twice a year in what we deem to be the flooding roads, which are the programme itself is generally up to date. So It's difficult to say whether the gully programme contributed. I think you made a very good point about whether the debris, should we say, that flows down from a road, blocks the gully, would actually have affected, what happened on that day. And if we take Portobello Road, for example, that was actually cleaned the day before the flood. And Portobello Road is swept maybe 3-4 times a day. Obviously, it's got markets, it's got commercial properties. There's a lot of footfall, so there'll be a lot of litter that could still, even with the constant presence that we've got. And there were gullies, because we had a look, there were gullies that were covered. But we tried to clean it. The amount of water that was there, it was an impossible job. So it's very difficult to say whether that would have an effect. I think on the level of water that occurred on that day, I don't think it would have had any effect at all, to be honest. And there were a couple of, we report what we call non-runners. So our crew will go out, they'll clean the gullies that we can clean. If there's gullies that aren't flowing, and clearly there's an issue, we report them back to highways. And we get a report back from highways to tell us when those gully plots have been repaired. So the process there is fairly good. And then in terms of, for example, cars parking lanes that block up. I think in the last 12-month period, I think we did about 1,100 parking suspensions. So again, if we're in a road, scheduled to be done, and there's blockages there in terms of parked cars, there's a process for us to go back and get those suspended and turn. That's what we do. So generally, the schedule is up to date. The question, I suppose, is annually enough? Is twice a year enough for those flood risk roads? Now, to be honest, I don't think I can answer that. I think generally, when we go around, the gullies are generally fairly clean. We dig out any detritus or silt during that process. And when we go back, we very rarely get what we call really sort of congealed non-runners, which would suggest to me that the frequency is adequate, but it wouldn't be adequate for dealing with what happened. It's a very difficult process. We only have one crew as part of it, because the frequency only warrants that. So I think, obviously there needs to be further investment if increasing the gully work which is required. But I think before that, I think we need to look at whether it would have an effect. I'm not convinced it would, to be honest.
And those streets most at risk of flooding, where is that information passed?
We've got it in a schedule. So we've got a schedule for flood risk roads, and they're broken into north and south, and we have sort of, I think there's about 4 or 5 sectors.
So that information comes from the council.
Yeah, the
those
flood
identified
risk,
as being
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So
That's a question to you, James. How does
so they're publishing the report. I think that's based on previous discussion, previous evidence. It's important to know there is one recommendation about kind of reviewing that and having a look to see whether that evidence, those streets are still appropriate. So there'll be ongoing discussions at officer level about whether that list is correct, whether some should be added, some should be potentially taken off, or the frequency changed at all, or some prioritised. So there's a separate recommendation to look into that, and as part of the report. But as Gary said, the evidence so far is that the frequency of cleaning the gullies isn't seen to be a significant contributing factor to the
conscious of time, I wonder if I could ask you to briefly present the section 19 of new and then the recommendations, and then I can open up questions to members now as well.
Yes. Yeah. So quickly, I just want to go through the impact on communities that we're aware of. I'll summarise some of the impacts there is in the report. So we're aware of at least 340 cities where flooded. We're conscious that it's likely to be high. The report sets out some of the direct impacts on residents' lives. It provides some personal accounts, it provides some personal evidence. What we didn't want to do is, completely strip out any of the personal impact on residents. Absolutely, we didn't want to do transaction strip out lots of things to, demonstrate the impact of present acts. To those who may not be aware, of the impact. It's important to note in the report as well that some residents are still out of their town, even this time after the flooding, because the flooding happened so quickly and seemingly went away so quickly from the residents. It's probably quite easy to think that everything's moved on. So we want to present in the report that residents are still onto their property. The report also goes into some of the infrastructure that was affected. So the station closed at Holland Park, Nottingham Gate, Sloane Square. Significant flooding of some of the roads in the area. There's also impact on local community facilities, so the libraries at North Kensington and some of the library were flooded. Other community facilities were also affected. We're aware of 3 schools that were significantly affected, so Colville Primary School, Havendale Park School, and Kingston Primary School were affected and are still undergoing repairs and still undergoing works to those. Some other community facilities, so the Muslim cultural heritage also flooded. And as well as that, the report presents the impact on businesses, particularly Road and so we didn't want to remove any that impact on the community. So hopefully it presents the experience of residents in those areas. It's difficult with a report like this to be specific enough to cover each location that residents experience themselves, but also be broad enough to cover the whole borough and cover the whole management. So yeah, hopefully it presents that.
I'm just kick off on that. You mentioned obviously a number of properties there happen to be all affected by the council itself. I'll slightly back to number 5. Do we have a risk management policy in place with the council?
In terms of protecting those properties or aware of those properties, I don't know where it would sit necessarily in terms of a policy as such. In the local flood risk management strategy and the surface water management plan, it does separate out some of those community facilities and makes recommendations for those. And partly related to those properties being at risk of flooding, but also in terms of the opportunities in the council properties to manage surface water. In
several states as well.
Estates, yeah, well, exactly, yes. So it's covered to a certain extent in the local management strategy. But in terms of other, wider plans as a whole.
Just one, if I may, I was going to provide a recommendation to policy for that here. In terms of the insurance, that's been a big problem, particularly not only triple premiums in some cases, but actually some cases I know it's cover at all. I was interested to read about the flood RE cover. How much do you insurance works as a mystery to most of us, I think, but how confident are you that is helping or will help people. It's not your council responsibility, but
No, yeah, so because of the number of representations that residents have put forward in terms of insurance, specifically in the question responses and we've had, insurance is really something that looked at as part of the Section 19 report, so followed up on. It will be covered in the next section, but just as a high level. We're aware that a number of properties and a number of residents are not eligible for the flood scheme, the government flood scheme, because of the subdivisions in the properties. In the wording of the eligibility, because I presume it wasn't set up with Kensington and Chelsea in mind, they limit the number of flats within the block. I've spoken to the General Council of Floodbury section and who's willing to provide separate evidence and separate representation for future events. And they are conscious that it does, particularly for the flooding in London, it does limit the number of people who are, limit the number of properties that are eligible. There are ways to potentially get around that and that depends on the freehold, the leasehold, split them in the block. That's quite complicated to be able to get into residents. But there are also moves to review that number, potentially review that upper limit of the number. So maybe that's in the next, I mean, it will be in the next few years by central government, review that upper limit so that may increase the eligibility across Kensington and Chelsea. Because if it was 5, it may bring most of the properties in the borough into eligibility.
Sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of my point that we clearly still haven't assumed that scheme. I'd be interested if you could, I don't know whether it's planned, but could have that representation in future sessions.
Yeah, I passed through contact details, and I think it's in the residents in the impact on those in section. I've also spoken to representatives of the National Flood Forum, so that's the charity who looks at who was set up for residents impacted by flooding across the country, and they have separately received representations from residents who have significant questions and issues with insurance.
Again, it's for probably the majority of our residents is not an issue. They can afford it, but there are a lot of people that can't, and I think that's the work that particularly that don't have cover that's a serious issue. So
I think it's also worth noting that we can come to as well. It's the scheme, the flood risk scheme now has they call it Build Back Better, which is every resident that's on the scheme can receive £10,000 to put in protection measures to their property to stop them flooding. So it's an incentivised scheme, so that you're not only eligible, you can claim funding, put in measures like really flood the water, if the properties are affected themselves, so they could potentially put in measures themselves. And that's something that's, flood protection measures is separately raised in the report recommendation. But eligibility for the scheme means that they can access funding.
Do you know percentage how many people are sticking to the accommodation who are social housing needs?
No, I don't think. I think they've either been rehomed within the council's housing stock, or they're having their property refurbished and moving back into those areas. I don't have a current figure. I can ask internally for the current.
I think this sounds to us about residents. I think that's important to residents finish up the recommendations. Anyone would like to?
Could I just ask one question? You keep talking about properties, what is a property? Is it a building or is it a single flat?
In terms of the property.
Yeah, in terms of you're talking about so many properties affected. Are these buildings or flats within the building?
I mean, often it's flats within the building. It's because often it was either the whole property if it's one dwelling, or if it was just the basement and that's a self-contained flat, then that would count as one property. Not. It's just the self-contained
Basically,
basement.
in my case, the whole block of flats, 42 flats,
Was affected, yes.
because we lost our common service. Still don't have our boiler, still don't have common services.
Yeah.
2 flats were wiped out, one water, but the rest of the block was still badly damaged and no insurance.
Yeah, so this is the case of Amazon. Yeah. So I think in terms of the number of properties for that overall number, I think I'm not sure. I can check what exact number.
Yeah.
is
Also,
used for
it
Amazon Court.
was a problem in reporting. Report makes quite something about this, that people in the block said, "Have you filled in this form? And can you fill it in for all of us?" Sort of thing. So I did, but you only received one form rather than 42 forms because they would all said the same thing.
Yeah. So we.
So sort of filling in on behalf of the building.
Yes. So there was the opportunity to fill the form online as well, and what we've now done with the new form that will be live in weeks will be separating out whether you are freeholder of a number of properties or a leaseholder of an individual property, and asking some of those questions. It simplifies the process to be able to identify exactly what number and what mechanism.
Well, briefly, I think it's a really important point because just to clarify, you don't have to have your flat flooded in order to be impacted by flooding.
Yes, and in definition, there is a separation between properties flooded and properties affected, because properties can be affected by not being able to kind of get out. If it's flooded externally, they may not be, the property itself may not be flooded, but access was affected, and so there is a kind of difference between a flooded property and an affected.
I live in the same block as the chairman of Anderson Court, and you'll see pictures of it in the report. I've had the benefit of reading this whole report, and I think it's really good. Can I give 2 credits to 2 people who work for you guys? James over there has bothered to come and see us, and I was very grateful. You've got a chap called Simon Minnie, who's in charge of your construction. He came and saw us on Friday and realised there was a serious problem with the formation of the pavement where we live and with the roadway. And they are going to fix it. Once we've got that little barrier up to stop the water coming up our driveway, they're going to build it up to that. Now, this brings me to the point I really want to raise with you. I don't think enough cross-department thinking's been going on. You were talking about the gullies cleaning. I've stood on Holland Park Avenue and watched the rain coming down from Notting Hill, straight away down to the hill at the bottom where we live, going straight across the top of the gullies. Now, I don't know whether the gullies were full, but what I can tell you is when you live at the bottom of the hill, the water comes down. And when it gets down, the curbstones help to guide it towards me. In addition to which, I have within spitting distance of my flat 3 sewers, Countess Creek, the Northwestern, and the North Kensington. I could see the manholes of all of them, and they all rose up on the day in question. So I think what I'm saying is, I'd like if somebody here could start looking at particularly vulnerable areas, because we clearly are, and not just because of this rotation of sewers there, and it's Thames Water's problem, not yours, something about that, but also because of the formation of the roads, the canvas of the roads, and the quality of the paving is sometimes directing water to places where it shouldn't be going. That's all I have to say.
I think it's a good question for the gentleman for Barry, because you think that, and in this report is also including the fracture collapsing. Do you review And then, as the lady said, what happens within the area? We just clean. We have some kind of reports.
No. Well, what we do, all we do is report the gullies that are, as I say, non-running, which are broken. And we do that on a daily basis. But we don't carry out any analysis of the areas and number of gullies that might be.
Who will be responsible?
Highway.
That would need to go to the highway department.
So who would activate it? If you are on the ground and you just clean it, who will actually assess physically from our borough to say, because the lady obviously pointed out something very important, and this is part of your, because I read it, I don't have to go again to find it, but it is here, because I read it, that actually there can be structural problem which creates water not going when it should be going.
But highways do, when we report that, the highways department will go down and carry out a survey, and then they will action that. So it obviously work is required.
So more or less it's you. Once you clean and you see the issue, you report to highways,
Absolutely,
they come and they fix it.
We report gullies every
And
day.
they collapse and go.
What's actually quite interesting is if you go down to Poolborough Road, that raised platform between Elgin and Preston,
Yeah.
and actually, water, as you rightly say, will go around in one direction.
Yeah.
And Thames Water did say you can actually have a property which just has a centimetre lower per entrance, and that's the one that gets the water because the others are
Right.
so it is really nuanced, I think, some of it. And what you don't want to do is find highways is designing that sort of water in one direction. Yeah, very valid point.
Before we go on to the next thing, for the record, would you be happy to briefly introduce yourselves?
I'm sorry,
Where you live,
my name's Bobby Vincent Emery.
And I'm Edward Mallory.
Very impressive. What I found very interesting is this is obviously and was very dramatic, the sewer flooding. And I found it very interesting, your slow dawning on the impact of the flip cups. Now, in a way, I think, I mean, I'm not so much concerned with that. I actually wasn't that affected by it. But the metre of soil in my street, which happens to be Elgin Crescent, is often interpreted as a raised metre, like a planter. It's not at all under the soil. And I've grown up in the communal garden I live on, and there is much more flooding in all the communal gardens. And the volume of clay that is taken out with every basement development is an incremental effect. And I think there ought to be a threshold at which an environmental impact assessment is done. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think your hydrologists were wrong, or were looking at too narrow a brief. But it's just watching that long-term impact build up. It's a slightly different issue than the sewers, but it is referred to a few times in this excellent report. And I just think it's something to think about, that's all. I mean, I'll gladly talk to anybody about it at greater length if they're curious and interested. Robina Rose, well-known, whatever, of this parish. That's it, really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any response to that?
Well, certainly garden levels aren't meant to be built up. I mean, the whole idea is that the place is meant to be sunk low enough to make sure that doesn't happen. So that shouldn't be happening. It is happening. It's important to our attention. So it's certainly not what policy. I mean, the only thing I can say, Ravina, and I know we've discussed it personally many times in the past, is that we can have another look at it. I'm very happy to circulate the report that we did at the time. If there's a particular issue that you're saying there is, yes, we can always look at it. But at the moment,
I mean, the report is excellent. You know, I mean, I realise this is a slightly different area, not entirely, ultimately, and I'll gladly talk about it with you again.
I think it's also worth to note that the review of the local flood risk management.
The review of
the local flood risk management stuff, which will be in the next 6 months.
Oh, good.
Includes groundwater flooding.
Oh, how many?
Because it's a local flood risk that's the responsibility of the local project. So we have one already. to including some of it's about that. So groundwater flooding will need to be included and covered as part of that. So there will be an opportunity to engage in specifically groundwater flooding as part of the local flooding solution. And that will be the body of evidence as part of that.
Thank you. Conscious of time, let's try and keep it to 15 maximum. Let's briefly talk about recommendations.
Yes. So the recommendations are summarised in the report. The kind of group, so some of them we've already discussed. Some of them can be almost like paused and held until the future session. So there are some related to the Thames Water Review, so we can cover those in more detail at the next session. There are some related to sustainable drainage, so we can cover those at the next session as well. We can do that. There are also some related to residents and individuals and communities. I think that probably is best placed at that the section on the local impact and those issues. So rather than kind of going through them all now just because they're in the report, it might be useful to come back to those at a later session. There are some related to communication. So there's one about the joint campaign of community engagement with Thames Water and Council. And as part of that, we've started discussions with Thames Water, but also around the anniversary, around this year, there's kind of numerous communication groups that both the council are in place and wider. So, but that doesn't mean to say that we won't be doing anything in the coming year, because we are aware that targeting messaging, targeting things that residents and individuals would be prepared is really important. So those discussions will happen, and potentially as well, and all that with Thames Water as well. More specifically around the council, so there's recommendation about property flood resilience, about looking at a potentially funded scheme so the residents can put in measures to protect their own property. I mentioned flood relief. Residents, if they're on that scheme, can access that funding. We've also put in a bid forward to the Environment Agency for funding from the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, so that residents can access funding to implement things like flood walls or flood barriers in front of their properties, and brick covers, those measures. If the property flooded from not just the toilet, not just the sewer, being able to access some funding for those measures. It's important to note that it's quite a long process, as I mentioned, to access the funding scheme. The good thing is with the Environment Agency, there is a framework in place where there can be a managing agent, a surveyor, all funded as part of the scheme. So what we have done is put that on the programme for the Environment Agency, which is the Flood and Coast Committee, so then it's in motion. The next one is a surface water forecasting system. So we have access to a surface water forecasting system now. So if you're saying hypothetically, if the same rainfall came, I would know, my resilience colleagues would know if that yellow rain will actually be in Chelsea in the next hour, in the next 24 hours. So we have access to much better information. What we're doing at the moment is looking at thresholds. So you need to set your own thresholds at which you're accepting that amount of rain and saying, I don't need to be warned for that amount of rain. So we're just streamlining that to make sure that those thresholds are appropriate. What we'll be looking to do in probably the next 3 months is open the sharing of that information internally. So at the moment it's communications resilience and legal local product quality, so that those who need to know can then disseminate information. But then we'll open that more widely, so it might be the highway quality or so might be aware of of something approaching, so that there's more preparedness for the event. We're also looking in probably the next 6 months plus to potentially send some of that messaging out to residents or communities, so that residents themselves, if there are flood protection regimes need to be put up or to be put up, we're looking at potentially sending those communications out. So that's a recommendation. We are actively working on that. We have already put measures in place. We mentioned the recommendations back earlier, so obviously we'll have a review of those streets to see what needs to happen. In terms of planning, there's a recommendation for critical drainage areas. So they're defined in our Stakeholder management plan as an area where there are strict planning policies. So what we'll be doing, probably as part of our local projects management, is reviewing whether those are appropriate, those areas, and whether they're still reflective of what happens. And there are final recommendations about emergency planning review, revising the monthly agency plot plan and process. And there's a recommendation for a trial incident, a test incident outside of actual planning to see whether the recommendations of the monthly agency are working. So,
thank you, James. There's one quote we'll delve into detail, I think, on all of those things. Everything else we discussed this evening, if we subsequently we scratch the surface of something this evening. Those recommendations, who is responsible in the council for making sure they're followed up? Obviously, some of the recommendations are things also for other authorities, but within the published how are those recommendations going to be followed up?
Yeah, so
it's responsible.
Yeah, so I've got to log all the recommendations and what I'm doing at the moment and have done is nominated individuals who would be basically owners of that recommendation that I can support or have the intent with. For instance, emergency planning recommendations will be handed over or have been handed over to the residents to make sure that their communities are on the map. I think I mentioned that previously that it may be useful to have a summary of progress against those recommendations. Again, maybe potentially coming back to the environment selection team when the next meets in the autumn, where progress against those can be updated to ensure that what needs to happen has happened.
Yes, another question. Let me just see what recommendation took place in 2007. I found this responsible to very outstanding. And I would like to know if you work with biodiversity officers, with parks, highways, and how you greenland it, since that is for me important.
So your first question about the 2007
recommendations, I just want to see.
So there wasn't an equivalent report with recommendations because we didn't have the duty in 2007. So we only adopted we only had the duty, the role as legal in 2010. Oh. There were other scrutiny functions that met after 2007, but those but yeah, so
there was a series of meetings with Thames Water
yes.
because of the concern about the sewer capacity. That's where the Counters Creek sewer scheme came forward. So that evolved with a number of meetings with residents. And Thames Water at the time was saying that would tackle quite a lot of problems with sewer capacity. Clearly, at some point, a few years ago, they backtracked on that and said, I think they obviously incredibly expensive, but they then said, well, actually, we don't think it will like that. We think that Flips could deal with it locally. Really saying the scheme was almost over-engineered. We did scrutinise that decision that they made, and it was the subject of a separate scrutiny committee where they had to turn up and justify what they've done. I think the debate on that still continues. I don't think we are necessarily convinced that the Counters Creek sewer wouldn't have actually mitigated impacts what they've done. But I think they're saying there's other ways of doing it without necessarily doing that scheme. But there was a lot of work that was done afterwards by them, fairness, to look at that. So, but obviously, as James said, this type of report would come in, wasn't regarded quite soon.
We have a biodiversity meeting, parks in our rural, how do we bring, taking consideration what happens outside our council and the big load.
Yeah, so I work quite closely with colleagues in ecology manager and colleagues in parks to understand what measures they're putting in. I know that there are some sustainable drainage features going in park, the kind of car park area this winter. So I'm working kind of closely with them. They have other priorities, but they're very conscious that to green streets, sustainable drainage, a really strong part of that. So other projects, we try to align objectives in terms of the superhighway and those kind of aspects. So to work quite closely, and they were involved in contributing projects towards the storing up on the website.
Can you produce a report, something for us to see, which is in the report, I can go and I can see what you have done.
In terms of
Greening and biodiversity on our streets.
so the projects that we've delivered in terms of sustainable drainage are on that story map, that website.
But you mentioned you work with biodiversity and ad hoc officers, so obviously they manage parks like Memorial Park, St. Mark's Park, Holland Park. So I just want to see how much of this 4 million is actually spent and implemented to plant more trees, like with those scrubs. How many trees you planted there? How many, I don't know, lavender you planted? Something which helps biodiversity. How many grass you planted to help the water to stay instead of flooding. This is in your report. So I want to see this report separately for biodiversity, what actually you're doing in terms of climate change.
Yes,
You know what I mean?
so the council has a separate biodiversity action plan, emergency action plan. So what we try to do is make sure that when we list and identify projects that are contributing to sustainable drainage, we include ones that have been delivered by parks, delivered by other parts of the council, not just ones that deliver only for sustainable drainage. So, for instance, the green roof on Avondale Park kiosk. So we've included that in our story map because it wasn't put into necessarily to sustainable drainage, but it forms a good example of sustainable drainage function.
Let's bring in, sorry, if we continue this conversation, I just want to bring in Councillor Brown and Primary Councillor Gray.
I think it is a great report, and I think the recommendations are solid. Clearly, working together comes out very, very strongly. And but what I really did get was resilience direct. I kind of almost felt like it was some sort of tool for people who wanted to pick up jobs, and I queried whether actually that's something we want to positively promote. So I thought perhaps you could explain it a bit more, and maybe I just didn't really sit.
Yeah, so resilience direct is a tool used by emergency planning across London. I'm not, entirely familiar with all the aspects of that, but what I understand is a tool that can enable collaboration across organisations involved in resilience in an area, so that information can be shared much more readily.
Is that fire brigade and all those things, or is it actually the plumbers? Because it reads as if it's
no. I believe it's just kind of emergency responders. So it'll be either the category 1 or category 2 responders, so that they can collaborate on aspects of resilience and emergency planning within an area.
congratulations on a really good report. I think all of this will agree that very informative and helps. I guess my $1 million question, probably everybody wants to be asked to, is how do we hold enforcement to account? I think that's probably where a lot of these problems sit. Clearly, teaching is an authority, things for other agencies, but that's also hold the most power. And how do we use this to make sure that they work through on that? Well, I know there's obviously their own review going on about having its own reviews, but
yeah.
Is there anything we can do as an authority?
Yeah, so I mean, at an officer level, in terms of they have 3 or 4 work streams going on at the moment. So one is the sewer resilience program, which is the surveys of properties. So what we're having is monthly meetings with Council to get an update on the number of residents they've contacted, the number of those residents, how many booked a survey, of those how many have completed the survey, so that we can track that progress and make sure that they are, delivering on what they've promised to do. They prioritise. I mean, the priority areas for them are against Chelsea, but they're having difficulty with getting responses back. So at an officer level, we're expecting that feedback. I think the session with the evidence session will be useful to pull together the various aspects and the various reviews and reports that have been going on that have now reported, so that independently has now been published. So then it's useful to do that. But also putting together their future plan and management. Because one needs to feed into the other, and it needs to be that if something can happen now that is on their forecast to happen in 2030, why isn't it? So I think that would be the difference between what's happening on the ground now in terms of the surveys, in terms of put into the properties, and then 2030 plan of making sewers bigger, and when there is a discrepancy, or whether they can bring forward into that, or whether there's any prioritisation. I think that will be a good area to investigate.
Thank you, James. Well, I think we've covered almost as much as we can realistically to 2.25 hours. Again, as mentioned, the work of the working group does continue in between the public meetings, so it's not that we have to analyse reports. I'm sure we'll be looking at, and we'll prepare for the next one. When the date of that is set, that will be publicised as broadly as possible. Anyone who isn't already signed up to the scrutiny, maybe just let us know as soon as possible. Autumn dates. All I can say, I suppose, for this evening is thank you to everyone who's joined us, the officers, to James particularly, has to do every talking. Thank you, Ken and Gary from Stewards. Appreciate your time, John as well. Colleagues and Anna, also thank you very much for joining us. And again, Stakeholder Council, Graham, I think great job on the course. And just to conclude, we are keen to hear from residents as much as possible in all of these public meetings. So please do tell our friends.
Really? Is that true?
It's a public meeting. We could have held this in private, but it's